The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and expensive cologne, the kind of room where family fortunes got decided in careful, clinical sentences, all polished wood, and diplomas framed just a little too perfectly on the walls. There were 8 of us crowded into chairs meant for 6, the overflow standing near the bookshelves, coffee cups balanced on knees, everyone dressed a shade more formal than usual, as if the occasion demanded it, even though we were really just there to hear a dead man's final instructions read out loud by a stranger in a gray suit. I'd driven 2 hours that morning to get there, leaving before sunrise, replaying old memories the whole way, Grandpa teaching me to fish off the dock at the lake house when I was 7, patient in a way none of the other adults in my family ever seemed to have time for, Grandpa slipping me $20 at every birthday with a wink and a "don't tell your cousins," even though I always suspected he told everyone the same thing. He died 3 weeks earlier, quietly, in his sleep, the kind of death people call peaceful, even though nothing about losing him had felt peaceful to me. I still hadn't fully absorbed that he was gone. Sitting in that office, surrounded by relatives already buzzing with anticipation, it felt less like a memorial and more like the opening bell of some competition I hadn't realized I was entered in. My cousin sat up straighter the moment the lawyer opened the folder, 3 of them in a neat row along the far wall, Danny cracking his knuckles, Priya checking her phone one last time before sliding it into her purse like she wanted to be seen giving this her full attention. My Aunt Ruth dabbed at her eyes with a tissue before he'd even said a word, already rehearsing gratitude, her lips moving slightly like she was mentally composing the thank you speech she'd give later, at whatever family dinner would inevitably follow. My father sat beside her, jaw tight, the particular kind of tense that meant he was doing math in his head, calculating percentages and property values, even as he tried to look appropriately somber. I sat near the back, in the chair closest to the door, the way I always did at these things, family dinners, holiday gatherings, the handful of weddings I'd been invited to more out of obligation than affection. It wasn't modesty, exactly. It was habit, the quiet self-erasure you learn early when you grow up as the grandchild nobody quite remembers to ask about, the one who shows up on the edges of photographs, technically present but rarely centered. I half expected, sitting there, to be forgotten entirely in whatever came next, the way I'd been forgotten in so many smaller ways over the years. Left off group texts, seated at the far end of tables, asked about my life last, if at all. The lawyer, a tall man named Mr. Fenwick with reading glasses perched low on his nose, cleared his throat and began working through the preliminaries, the legal language dense and slow, full of hereinafter and in accordance with. I watched my relatives lean forward almost imperceptibly with every clause, waiting for the part that mattered. The numbers, the names, the division of everything Grandpa had spent 81 years accumulating. Grandpa's estate was worth just over $4 million, split, according to the will, mostly between my father, my aunt, and my 3 cousins, the house on Sycamore Street where he'd raised his kids, the stock portfolio he'd quietly built over 4 decades of unglamorous, disciplined investing, and the lake property he'd spent 30 summers fixing up, board by board, dock by dock. A place that held more of my childhood than any other single location on Earth. When Mr. Fenwick read out the figures attached to each name, applause almost broke out, an absurd impulse in a room meant for grief, but nobody quite managed to suppress the relief written plainly across their faces. My father actually laughed, a short, startled sound, relief spilling out of him like he'd been holding his breath for weeks, maybe months, maybe since the funeral itself. My aunt pressed her tissue to her mouth and nodded rapidly, already glancing sideways at Priya as if to say, "See, everything's going to be fine now." I sat there watching all of it unfold, feeling strangely distant from the celebration, like I was observing it through glass. Not because I begrudged them the money, I didn't, not really, not in that moment, but because some old, familiar part of me had already braced for my own name to pass by unmentioned, folded quietly into the background the way it always had been. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I hadn't come for money anyway, that I'd come because he was my grandfather, and I wanted to hear his voice one last time, even filtered through a lawyer's flat, professional reading. Then the lawyer turned a page, cleared his throat again, and read my name. The room didn't go quiet immediately. It took a second, A beat of confused recalibration, heads turning slightly to locate me in the back row, as if people had genuinely forgotten I was there at all. Mr. Fenwick adjusted his glasses and read the line slowly, giving each word its own weight. And to my grandson, who never once asked me for anything, I leave this. He reached into the folder and pulled out a small, unassuming index card, the kind you'd use for a recipe, slightly yellowed at the corners like it had been sitting somewhere for years waiting for this exact moment. He slid it across the table toward me, and I had to stand and walk forward to take it, aware of every eye in the room following the movement, the sudden, uncomfortable spotlight of attention I so rarely occupied in that family. On it, in Grandpa's shaky handwriting, the same handwriting from decades of birthday cards, the same trembling script from his last few years when his hands had started giving him trouble, was a single phone number. No name attached to it. No explanation, no context, nothing to indicate whether this was meant as a gift, a joke, or something else entirely. Just 10 digits, and beneath them, one line that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't immediately explain. Call it when you're ready to know who I really was. The room went quiet for a long moment, everyone absorbing what had just happened, processing the stark contrast between the millions just distributed and the scrap of paper now sitting in my hand. Then, almost as if on cue, it erupted into muffled laughter. My cousins exchanging glances like this was the punchline of some private joke they were all suddenly in on together. Danny actually snorted, covering his mouth with his fist. Priya whispered something to him I couldn't hear, and whatever it was made him laugh harder. My Aunt Ruth actually smirked, an expression I recognized from a lifetime of family gatherings where I'd been the quiet afterthought, the reliable source of mild amusement rather than genuine consideration. Guess the old man had a sense of humor, she said, already reaching for the small glass of champagne someone had thoughtfully poured in anticipation of good news, the bottle apparently having been brought along in expectation of exactly this kind of celebration. Nobody offered to trade. Nobody seemed to think, even for a moment, that there was anything worth trading for. A card with a phone number, set against houses and stocks and a lake property, wasn't even a real inheritance in their eyes, just Grandpa's odd little joke at my expense, a final flourish of the quiet mischief he'd always been known for. I folded the card carefully into my pocket, feeling the stiff edges press against my palm, and I sat back down for the remainder of the reading, though I barely absorbed anything else that was said. When it finally ended, my relatives clustered together near the door, already making plans, already discussing renovations to the lake house, and which stocks to hold, and which to sell, their voices bright and easy in a way that felt almost obscene given we'd buried Grandpa less than a month earlier. I left before the toast started, slipping out quietly the way I always did, the card burning a strange, quiet weight in my pocket the entire drive home. I didn't call it that night. I set the card on my kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time, turning it over once or twice, half expecting the back to reveal some hidden joke, some punchline that would make sense of the whole thing. There was nothing there, just blank cardstock, slightly worn at the edges. I didn't call it for almost a week, if I'm honest, half convinced it really was exactly what my aunt had assumed, some final bit of mischief from a man who'd always found other people's disappointment funnier than his own good fortune, a last laugh at my expense dressed up as an inheritance. But something about the way he'd written it, "When you're ready," kept nagging at me in quiet moments at red lights, in the middle of folding laundry, like he'd known exactly how long it would take me to work up the nerve, like this had never really been a joke at all. When I finally dialed almost a week later, sitting on the edge of my bed with the card in one hand and my phone in the other, my thumb hovering over the last digit for a good 30 seconds before I actually pressed it, a woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful, almost rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for this call for longer than made sense for a random string of digits handed out at a will reading. I sat there for a second after she said hello, not entirely sure how to begin, feeling suddenly foolish, like I'd fallen for some elaborate practical joke that was about to reveal itself as a telemarketer or a wrong number. "Hello," she said again, gentler this time, like she could sense my hesitation through the line.
"Hi," I said.
"My name is," and I gave her my name, feeling strange saying it out loud into a phone for reasons I couldn't articulate. She went quiet for a moment, long enough that I almost asked if she was still there. Then she said, "I've been expecting you. Your grandfather said you'd be the one to eventually call." Something in her tone made the hair on my arm stand up, a mixture of warmth and gravity that told me, instantly, this was not a joke, not a prank, not anything close to what my family had assumed in that lawyer's office. Her name was Marianne. She had a low, steady voice, the kind that made you want to sit up and pay attention, and over the course of the next hour, in a conversation I ended up taking notes on with a shaking hand because I couldn't quite trust my memory to hold everything she was telling me, she explained who she was and how she'd come to be connected to my grandfather. She'd known him for almost 40 years, not as a friend exactly, not in the way I'd assumed at first, but as the woman who'd managed a second life he'd never told any of us about, a quiet financial and legal arrangement that had run parallel to his entire visible existence, without a single ripple showing on the surface. Before the family business, before the lake house, before any of the things my relatives had spent that afternoon dividing up with such enthusiasm and relief, my grandfather had quietly built and sold a small manufacturing patent in his 20s, some kind of mechanical improvement to an irrigation system, Marianne explained. Details I only half understood but which apparently had been valuable enough, decades ago, to set him up for life if he'd chosen to live differently. He hadn't. He'd taken the proceeds and, instead of folding them into the family's visible wealth, instead of buying a bigger house or a flashier car or telling anyone at all, he'd placed them into a trust that Marianne had personally overseen ever since, watching it grow quietly through decades of careful, unglamorous investment, untouched, unmentioned, waiting. He always said the family would fight over the visible money, she told me, and I could hear something like fondness in her voice, the particular affection of someone who'd spent 40 years managing another person's secret without ever betraying it. He wanted to see who'd bother looking for what wasn't visible at all. I sat with that for a long moment after she said it, turning it over, feeling the full weight of what he'd apparently been testing all along. Not just me, but everyone. The house, the stocks, the lake property, all of it handed out plainly, immediately gratifying, requiring nothing but a signature and a smile. And then this, a single index card, a phone number, an instruction that offered no promise of reward, nothing that suggested there was anything worth finding at all. Most people, I realized sitting there with the phone pressed to my ear, would have thrown that card away within a week. Most people had, in fact, already dismissed it as a joke in that very room, laughing over champagne while I sat holding what turned out to be the most significant thing he'd ever given anyone. The trust, Marianne told me, was worth just under $2 million, held entirely separately from the will, invisible to lawyers and probate, and every relative currently toasting champagne over a house and some stocks they assumed represented the whole of Grandpa's fortune. It had one condition attached to it, scrawled in Grandpa's own increasingly shaky handwriting on the original trust documents, a condition Marianne read aloud to me slowly, like she wanted to make sure I understood every word of it. It could only be claimed by someone who called the number without being told what waited on the other end, someone who trusted him enough, even in death, to follow instructions that looked, on the surface, like nothing at all. Someone, in other words, who had never needed proof of his love or his attention while he was alive, and who wouldn't need proof of a reward now that he was gone either. "He talked about you," Marianne said, near the end of our call, her voice softening in a way that caught me off guard. "More than you probably realized. He used to say you were the only one who ever visited him without wanting something. Fixed his porch steps one summer without being asked. Sat with him during his chemo appointments a few years back, when the others were always too busy." I hadn't realized he'd told anyone about that, hadn't realized any of it had registered as significant to him at the time. It had simply felt, to me, like the ordinary things you do for someone you love. Hearing it repeated back to me now, through a stranger's voice, in the aftermath of everything, undid something in my chest I hadn't expected to feel undone. I didn't tell my family right away. I let them enjoy their week, let the toasts and the relief run their course, the renovation plans and stock discussions I caught wind of through the family group chat I mostly ignored these days. Some petty, quiet part of me wanted to hold this for myself a little longer, The way I'd held so many things quietly for so long without anyone noticing or asking. Every small kindness I'd done for Grandpa over the years that nobody else had bothered with. Every visit, every fixed porch step, every quiet afternoon spent listening to his stories while everyone else found reasons to be elsewhere. This felt, for once, like something that was mine without qualification, without needing to be shared or explained or justified to a room full of people who'd never once thought to wonder what I might need. When I finally did tell them, 3 weeks later, sitting around my father's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon that had started out ordinary enough, the reaction wasn't what I expected. My Aunt Ruth's first response wasn't congratulations, or even surprise exactly. It was outrage, immediate and sharp, a demand to know why I hadn't shared this information sooner, as if the inheritance I'd been handed almost as an afterthought was somehow theirs to renegotiate too, as if my quiet, private connection to a man they'd all claimed to love was suddenly up for family debate the moment real money entered the picture. My father sat there mostly silent, jaw working, and I could see him doing the same mental math he'd done in the lawyer's office weeks earlier, recalculating percentages that had never actually included me in the first place. "That's not fair," Priya said, arms crossed, though she couldn't quite articulate what exactly was unfair about a dead man leaving something to the one grandchild who'd actually shown up for him. Danny didn't say much at all, just stared at me like he was trying to reconcile this version of events with the story he'd apparently been telling himself for years, the quiet cousin in the back row, the one nobody needed to think about. I let them talk for a while, the way I always did, absorbing the noise without much reaction, and then I told them, calmly, what Marian had told me, about the porch steps, the chemo appointments, the quiet decades of a second life Grandpa had built specifically to see who would come looking without being promised anything. Nobody had a response to that. The kitchen went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence in the lawyer's office weeks earlier, heavier somehow, weighted with the particular discomfort of people realizing, all at once, that the story they'd been living inside their whole lives might not have been the whole story at all. I kept the card. I still have it, actually, tucked in the drawer of my desk beside a handful of old photographs and a birthday card from years ago with the same shaky handwriting, 10 digits that turned out to be worth more than everything else divided up in that office combined. Not because of the number itself, not really, but because it was the one thing Grandpa had ever given me that required me to actually earn it, to trust him the way I'd always trusted him, long after everyone else in that family had apparently stopped believing there was anything left to trust him for. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and look at it, running my thumb along the worn edges, and I think about how close I came to throwing it away that first week, convinced it was nothing, convinced I'd been forgotten again the way I always assumed I would be. I think about how he must have known that too, must have understood exactly how long doubt would keep me from calling, and written that line anyway, when you're ready, patient even from beyond the grave, willing to wait for me the same way he always had while he was alive.